Hello, and welcome to the Whispered Lore. Settle in and allow the sounds of the world to fade into a gentle quiet. Tonight, we are not concerned with kings or with battles, but with the silent, beating heart of the medieval fortress. Our journey takes us into the domain of the castle's steward, the keeper of order and the master of its daily rhythm. We will explore the intricate, methodical world of administration and supply, a world governed not by the sword, but by the quiet jingle of keys on a belt. In this study, The Steward's Keys, we will uncover the steady, careful processes that allowed these great stone households to thrive. So close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let us begin. The castle. It stands as a profound symbol in the collective memory, an icon of power, conflict, and romance. We see its silhouette against a dramatic sky, its crenellated battlements sharp and defiant. We imagine the clash of steel, the flutter of pennants in the wind, the lonely vigil of a sentry gazing out across the darkening land. This is the castle of saga and song, a stage for kings and knights, for sieges and chivalry. But this is not our story. Our journey takes us beyond the battlements, past the grim portcullis and the echoing gatehouse. We turn away from the armory and the training yard, and instead, we seek out a series of far more prosaic, yet infinitely more vital, locations. We seek the buttery, the pantry, the larder, the granary. We descend into the cellars and climb to the solar. We unroll the stiff parchment of the household accounts and examine the notched surfaces of wooden tally sticks. Our subject is not the projection of power, but its maintenance. For a castle was not merely a fortress, it was a complex, self-contained economic and social engine. It was a residence, a center of government, an industrial complex, and a vast storage depot. And the true strength of this engine, the very lifeblood that coursed through its stone arteries, was not martial prowess, but meticulous, relentless, and often tedious administration. This is a study of the steward's keys, not the ceremonial keys to the city, but the heavy, cold, iron keys that open the storerooms. The keys that granted access to the sacks of flour, the casks of ale, the barrels of salted fish, and the chests of coin. The individuals who held these keys, the steward, the chamberlain, the reeve, the clerk, were the architects of the castle's survival. Their battlefield was the ledger, their weapon the quill, and their enemy was not a besieging army, but the slow, insidious creep of scarcity, waste, and decay. To understand the medieval castle, one must first understand its metabolism. It was a perpetually hungry entity, consuming vast quantities of resources on a daily basis. A modest household of a minor lord might consist of 50 or 60 individuals. A great royal castle, such as Windsor or Dover in the 13th century, could house hundreds. The lord's family, knights, men-at-arms, squires, pages, chaplains, clerks, and a legion of domestic servants, from the master cook down to the lowliest scullion. Each of these individuals required feeding, clothing, and lodging. Each required fuel for warmth and light. The most fundamental challenge was victualling, the provision of food and drink. The cornerstone of the medieval diet was grain, processed into bread and ale. The castle's granary was therefore one of its most critical assets. Here, wheat for the fine manchet bread of the lord's table was stored separately from the barley and rye used for the coarser household bread and the brewing of ale. The grain arrived from the lord's own domain lands, the portion of the manor farmed directly for his benefit. It was brought in carts from the fields, threshed in the great barn, and then winched in sacks to the upper floors of the granary. Meticulous records were kept, measuring the grain by the bushel, noting its source and its quality. The steward's accounts would differentiate between grain received as rent from tenants and grain harvested by the lord's own serfs. From the granary, a steady stream of grain would flow to the castle's mill to be ground into flour, and from there to the bakehouse and the brewhouse, two essential, perpetually active hubs of castle life. The brewhouse alone was a significant logistical operation. Ale was the staple drink for all classes, safer than water, and a vital source of calories. Brewing required not just the barley from the granary, but a steady supply of fresh water and enormous quantities of firewood or charcoal to heat the great copper vats. Within the complex, hierarchical machinery of the medieval castle, no single figure, save for the lord himself, was as pivotal as the steward. Often known by the Anglo-Norman term seneschal, the steward was the chief administrator, the prime minister of the castle's domestic and economic life. His authority was represented not by a sword or a banner, but by a simple, potent symbol, a ring of iron keys. These keys, jangling at his belt, were the tangible manifestation of his control. They unlocked the storerooms, the cellars, the granaries, and the treasury. But metaphorically, they unlocked the very potential of the Lord's domain, transforming raw resources into a functioning, defensible, and sustainable household. The steward's role was not one of glamour or martial prowess. It was a role of meticulous detail, relentless oversight, and profound responsibility. He was the architect of order in a world that constantly threatened to descend into chaos. To understand the steward, one must first understand the dual nature of the entity he managed. A great castle was both a military fortress and the administrative heart of a sprawling agricultural estate known as the domain. The steward's purview encompassed both. His duties extended far beyond the cold stone of the curtain walls. He was responsible for the productivity of the lord's lands, overseeing the reeves and bailiffs who managed the individual manors. He would have been intimately familiar with crop rotation schedules, with the health of the livestock, and with the yields of the fields, orchards, and fisheries. The annual cycle of plowing, sowing, and harvesting was as much a part of his calendar as the religious feasts. Records from the period, such as the manorial accounts of estates like those of the Bishop of Winchester, show the granular level of detail required. The steward would need to know how many bushels of wheat were expected from a particular field, how much wool the Lord's flocks had produced, and how many gallons of cider could be pressed from the autumn apple harvest. This produce was the lifeblood of the castle. It was the raw material that, under the steward's direction, would become the bread on the table, the ale in the mugs, and the wages, paid in kind, for the castle's many servants and retainers. Beyond agriculture, the steward administered the Lord's justice on a local level. He presided over the manorial court, or court leet, settling disputes between tenants, levying fines for minor infractions, and ensuring the Lord's rights and privileges were upheld. Here, his role was one of impartial but firm authority. He would hear arguments over land boundaries, adjudicate cases of petty theft, and enforce the obligations of feudal tenure. This judicial function was not separate from his economic role, it was integral to it. A well-ordered, law-abiding tenantry was a productive tenantry. By ensuring the smooth operation of local justice, the steward was safeguarding the very foundation of the Lord's income and power. The primary instrument of the steward's control, the tool that allowed him to manage this vast and complex enterprise, was the account. The medieval world was one of nascent but rapidly developing bureaucracy, and the steward was its chief practitioner. The great annual account, the computus, was the culmination of his year's work. This was a painstaking audit where the steward, before the Lord or his designated auditors, would account for every penny spent and every item consumed. The evidence for these accounts came in many forms. The most iconic, perhaps, is the tally stick. This simple piece of wood, typically hazel or willow, was a brilliant and largely tamper-proof accounting device. A debt or a delivery would be recorded by carving notches of varying sizes into the stick. A large notch might represent a pound, a smaller one, a shilling, a simple score, a penny. The stick was then split lengthwise, down the middle of the notches. The medieval castle, viewed from a distance, presents an image of static and monolithic power. Its stone walls seem to rise from the earth as a single, indivisible entity, a bulwark against the uncertainties of the world beyond. Yet, to understand the castle is to look past its crenellations and curtain walls, to move through the gatehouse and into the bailey, and to perceive it not as a mere fortress, but as a complex, living organism. It is an economic engine, a political capital, a social microcosm, and a vast domestic household, all functioning in delicate, prescribed harmony. The lifeblood of this organism is not stone, but system. Its strength is not merely in its defenses, but in its administration. This internal architecture of command, this carefully calibrated hierarchy of office and duty, is the true key to the castle's endurance. It is within this framework that we find the Lord's inner circle, the human gears of the great machine. At the apex of this structure, whether in physical residence or as an absent guiding authority, is the Lord himself. All power, all land, and all fealty flow from and back to him. His word is, in effect, law within his domain. However, the great lords of the high medieval period were often peripatetic, moving between their various estates, attending the royal court, or engaged in military campaigns. The castle, therefore, could not rely on his constant, direct supervision. Its daily operation required a proxy, a figure of delegated authority. This was the role of the castellan, or constable. Appointed by the Lord, the castellan was the chief executive in his absence. He held the castle in the Lord's name, responsible for its military readiness, its judicial integrity, and its overall administration. The authority of the castellan was near absolute within the castle walls, a reflection of the Lord's own power. He commanded the garrison, presided over legal matters, and was the final arbiter of disputes. His position was one of immense trust, for in his hands lay the physical security of the Lord's regional power base, and the well-being of all who resided within. Working in parallel, and sometimes overlapping in the domestic sphere, was the lady of the castle. Her role was not merely passive or decorative. The lady was the mistress of the domus, the great household. She held her own set of keys and her own sphere of influence, primarily centered on the domestic and internal life of the castle. This included the supervision of the women's quarters, the education of the young wards and pages, the production of textiles in the weaving rooms, and the management of the castle's apothecaries and herb gardens. In matters of supply, she often held direct oversight of the dairy, the poultry yards, and the production of preserved goods, a vital contribution to the castle's long-term sustainability. Her authority complemented that of the castellan, creating a balance between the external, military-focused governance and the internal, domestic order. Beneath this highest echelon of lord, lady, and castellan, we find the great officers of the household, the senior administrators, who formed the Lord's council and oversaw the primary departments. Chief among these, in most large households, was the steward, or seneschal. The steward was the Lord's chief of staff, the prime minister of the castle's intricate government. His responsibilities were vast and encompassing. He was the master of the estate's finances, responsible for overseeing the collection of rents and dues from the Lord's manors, and for auditing the accounts of all other departments. He presided over the manorial court, dispensing justice in the Lord's name for civil and tenurial matters. Within the castle itself, the steward held supreme authority over the entire domestic staff, from the clerks in the counting house to the scullions in the kitchen. The medieval castle, often perceived as a monolithic bastion of military might, was in truth the nucleus of a complex and sprawling agricultural and economic entity, the manor. Its stone walls and towering keeps were entirely dependent on the steady, rhythmic, and predictable production of the surrounding lands. The steward, in his administrative capacity, was less a commander of soldiers and more a manager of this vast, living machine. His keys did not merely unlock storerooms. They represented control over the very source of the castle's sustenance. This is the story of that source, the journey from the soil of the field to the sustenance of the feast, a journey governed by the unyielding logic of the manor system. The physical manifestation of this system, the manor itself, was a meticulously organized, albeit organically developed, landscape designed for maximum agricultural output and administrative control. At its heart lay the domain, the land reserved exclusively for the Lord's direct profit. This was not a single consolidated farm, but was typically comprised of numerous strips of land, interspersed with those of the tenants, scattered across the manor's great open fields. Upon the domain were grown the cash crops, and, more importantly, the vast quantities of grain, wheat for the Lord's fine bread, barley for his ale, oats for the stables, that would eventually be carted to the castle granaries. Surrounding the domain, and interwoven with it, were the peasant holdings. The dominant feature here was the open field system. The arable land of the manor was divided into two, or more commonly, three enormous fields. One field would be sown in the autumn with winter wheat or rye. The second would be sown in the spring with oats, barley, peas, or beans. The third would be left fallow, unplanted, to recover its fertility, a silent, patient testament to the limitations of medieval agronomy. Each peasant family, or tenement, held not a consolidated plot, but a series of long, narrow strips, known as celians, distributed across all three fields. This arrangement, seemingly inefficient to the modern eye, was a product of practical necessity. It ensured that each family received a share of the good, mediocre, and poor land, and it facilitated the communal effort of plowing, as few peasants owned a full plow team of 8 oxen and had to pool their resources. The landscape was thus a patchwork of ridges and furrows, a testament to centuries of shared labor with the heavy-wheeled plow. Beyond the plowed fields lay the other essential components of the manorial economy. There was the common pasture, where the livestock of both lord and peasant could graze under the watchful eye of a common herdsman. There were the meadows, a source of precious hay, vital for seeing the animals through the lean winter months. These were often temporarily enclosed and divided into strips for the hay harvest before being opened again for grazing. And then there was the woodland and the waste. This was not unproductive land. It was a critical resource. The woodland provided timber for construction and repairs, firewood for the hearths, and crucially, pannage, the right for peasants to graze their pigs on fallen acorns and beech mast. The so-called waste provided peat for fuel, stone from small quarries, and rough grazing for the hardiest of animals. Every element of the landscape was accounted for. Every resource assigned a purpose and a set of rights governing its use. The human geography of the manor was as rigidly structured as its physical layout. At the apex, often in absentia, was the Lord. His direct authority on site was wielded by his appointees. The steward or seneschal might oversee several manors, his visits periodic but significant, a time for auditing accounts and resolving major disputes. The day-to-day presence of the Lord's authority was the bailiff, a man tasked with maximizing the profitability of the domain. While the steward operated from a position of administrative oversight, often traveling between his lord's various holdings, the daily, granular management of the individual manor fell to another figure, one whose hands were calloused and whose boots were thick with the soil of the very fields he managed. This was the reeve, the propositus, the linchpin of the manorial economy. His world was not one of strategic supply chains and castle garrisons, but of seed yields, plow teams, and the perpetual, cyclical turning of the agricultural year. The reeve's reckoning was a constant, a quiet hum of calculation and observation that dictated the prosperity or failure of the estate, and by extension, the flow of resources to the castle it served. The position of reeve was an ambiguous one, poised uncomfortably between the lord's authority and the community of the unfree. Typically, the reeve was a villain himself, a peasant chosen from among the most able or prosperous tenants of the manor. This selection could be a form of election by the village community, a nomination then approved by the lord or his steward, or a direct appointment. It was rarely a coveted role. To be made reeve was to be burdened with a responsibility that invited resentment from one's neighbors and scrutiny from one's superiors. For his service, the reeve might be excused from his normal labor dues, receive a small stipend, or be permitted to graze extra animals on the common land. But these perquisites were small compensation for the weight of the office. He was the local enforcer of the Lord's will, the man who had to ensure his fellow villagers performed their obligatory, and often resented, labor services on the Lord's personal land, the domain. The reeve's work was governed not by a clock or a modern calendar, but by the liturgical year and the immutable cycle of the seasons. His year began at Michaelmas, the 29th of September, the traditional date for the settling of accounts and the start of the new agricultural cycle. With the harvest gathered, his first major task was overseeing the autumn plowing. He had to assess the condition of the Lord's plows, ensuring the iron of the plowshare was sound and the wooden frame sturdy. He was responsible for organizing the domain plow teams, typically consisting of 8 oxen, yoked in pairs. He had to know which of the Lord's open field strips were to be plowed, and to what depth, a calculation based on soil type and the previous year's crop. Following the plows came the sowing of winter grains, primarily wheat for bread and rye for its hardiness on poorer soils. The reeve's task here was one of meticulous measurement. He would dispense the seed corn from the Lord's grange, carefully recording the amount used against the acreage sown. Surviving manorial accounts, such as those detailed in treatises like Walter of Henley's Husbandry, show an obsession with this ratio of seed to yield. The reeve was expected to know, almost to the peck, how much seed a particular field required, and he would be held to account if the resulting harvest was poor. Once sown, the fields were harrowed, a process of dragging a heavy wooden frame studded with iron or wooden teeth over the soil to cover the seed and protect it from birds. Winter brought a change of pace, but not an end to work. With the fields dormant under frost, the reeve's attention turned inward. His primary concern was the livestock. He oversaw the feeding of the domain animals, rationing the precious hay and fodder gathered in the summer. He monitored the herd for signs of disease, particularly the dreaded murrain which could wipe out a lord's entire stock of cattle or sheep. Within the great manorial barn, the air would be thick with dust as laborers threshed the harvested grain, beating the sheaves with jointed wooden flails to separate the wheat from the chaff. The castle, as a projection of power and a center of regional administration, was fundamentally an economic entity. Its martial prowess, its political influence, and the very survival of its inhabitants were predicated not on the strength of its walls alone, but on the careful, systematic management of its resources. At the heart of this system, often overlooked in favor of more dramatic accounts of siege and chivalry, lie the humble, yet essential, spaces of storage, the granary and the cellar. These were the twin anchors of the castle's existence, the physical embodiment of the steward's foresight, and the bulwark against the lean months of winter and the uncertainties of medieval life. The securing of the harvest was not a single event, but a continuous process of acquisition, preservation, and meticulous distribution, a cycle governed by the seasons and overseen by the ever-watchful steward. Let us first consider the granary, or garnier, in the Anglo-Norman lexicon. Its location and construction were matters of supreme logistical importance. Ideally, the granary was a standalone structure within the relative safety of the bailey, built of stone to mitigate the ever-present risk of fire, a catastrophe that could doom a garrison more surely than any trebuchet. Its walls were thick, not for defense against men, but against the more insidious enemies of damp and vermin. The floor was often raised from the ground upon staddle stones, mushroom-shaped pillars of stone that elevated the entire structure. This simple but ingenious design served a dual purpose. It discouraged rats and mice from burrowing their way in from below, and it allowed for the circulation of air beneath the floorboards, a critical element in combating moisture that could lead to rot and mold. Windows in a granary were few, small, and set high in the walls. They were not for illumination, but for ventilation. often covered with wooden shutters or latticework rather than expensive glass. This design minimized the entry of rain and reduced the amount of light that could encourage germination or spoilage. The goal was to create an environment that was cool, dark, and, above all, dry. The interior space was typically a large, open hall, perhaps with a second story or loft accessible by a wooden ladder or staircase. This space would be subdivided by wooden partitions into large bins or bays. Into these bins, the lifeblood of the castle was poured. The primary contents were, of course, the cereal grains. Wheat, the most prized, was destined for the Lord's table and the production of fine manship bread. Barley, hardier and more versatile, was the essential ingredient for the brewing of ale, the staple beverage for all inhabitants, as well as for pottage and coarser bread. Oats were vital as fodder for the horses in the stables, the engines of medieval transport and warfare. Rye, a resilient crop often grown on poorer soils, provided the dark, dense bread that formed a significant part of the diet for soldiers and servants. The grain arrived at the castle as part of the domain harvest, cultivated on the lord's own lands, or as feudal dues, paid in kind by tenants. It arrived in sacks of coarse hessian, carried on carts that creaked under the weight of the autumn's bounty. The steward, or a trusted reeve under his command, would oversee the intake. Each sack would be inspected. He would plunge his hand deep into the grain, feeling for its temperature and moisture content. Too warm or too damp, and it might already be starting to spoil. He would bring a handful to his nose, sniffing for the telltale musty, sour scent of mildew or the sharp, acrid smell of rodent contamination. He would examine the kernels for signs of insect infestation, such as the minute holes bored by weevils. Once accepted, the grain was either stored in its sacks, stacked carefully to allow for air circulation, or, more commonly, tipped loose into the vast wooden bins. Within the intricate machinery of the medieval castle, a complex organism of defense, governance, and domesticity, no functions were more fundamental, more rhythmically essential, than those housed within the bakery and the brewery. These were not mere kitchens, but semi-industrial hubs, the pulsing heart of the castle's metabolism, converting the raw agricultural wealth of the demesnes into the daily caloric currency that fueled every aspect of life. The steward, in his administrative capacity, understood that the security of the walls was meaningless without the security of the larder, and the foundation of that larder was grain, transformed into its two vital states, the solid loaf and the liquid ale. We turn our attention now to these twin pillars of sustenance, the pistorium, or bakehouse, and the bracinum, the brewhouse. Often situated in close proximity to one another, perhaps sharing a wall or occupying adjacent buildings within the outer bailey, the bakery and brewery were strategically placed for logistical efficiency. Their location was dictated by practical needs: access to a reliable water source, such as a well or cistern, proximity to the granary for the constant supply of flour and malted barley, and a position that minimized fire risk to the more vulnerable residential structures of the inner ward. They were robust, functional buildings, typically of stone construction with flagged floors that could be easily sluiced clean. Their air was thick, with the distinctive, earthy aromas of yeast, warm grain, and wood smoke, a constant olfactory reminder of the castle's unceasing cycle of consumption and production. Let us first examine the pistorium. At its core, both physically and functionally, was the great oven, the furnace. This was a significant piece of masonry, a large, domed structure built of brick or stone and lined with heat-retaining clay. Its design was a testament to thermal efficiency. A low, arched opening, the mouth, allowed access to the baking chamber. The fire, typically of well-seasoned faggots of wood, would be built directly inside this main chamber. For hours, the fire would burn, its intense heat slowly being absorbed by the dense mass of the oven's structure. The skill of the master baker, the pister, was in judging this process. He knew by the color of the interior bricks, glowing a pale, uniform white. And by the way, a cast handful of flour would instantly blacken and char when the optimal temperature had been reached. The process of baking began long before the oven was fired. It began with the grain, meticulously accounted for by the steward. Wheat and rye, delivered from the manorial estates, were stored in the castle's granary, a structure designed to be cool, dry, and as vermin-proof as possible. From the granary, a specified quantity of grain, measured in bushels, would be sent to the mill. Here, it was ground between massive millstones, a process that itself was a source of revenue and control for the lord. The resulting flour was not uniform. It was sifted or bolted through cloths of varying coarseness to produce different grades. The finest, whitest flour, from the very heart of the wheat kernel, was reserved for the lord's table to make, pandemain, or lord's bread. A slightly coarser, but still high-quality wholemeal flour would become cheat bread for the upper household. The coarsest flour, containing much of the bran and germ, was used for the common, household, loaf, the sustenance of the garrison, and lower servants. Back in the pastorium, the baker and his assistants would begin their labor at a massive wooden kneading trough. The first ingredient was the leaven, a piece of dough reserved from the previous day's bake, which had been allowed to ferment slowly, cultivating a colony of wild yeasts. This sourdough starter was mixed with water, salt, and the day's allotment of flour. The great hall of a medieval castle was not merely a dining room. It was the administrative heart, the judicial chamber, the primary reception area, and the most potent symbol of a lord's power and wealth. Its very operation, the daily act of feeding the household, was a constant and demanding exercise in logistical management. The flow of consumables into, through, and out of the castle's storerooms, kitchens, and ultimately onto the trestle tables of the hall represented the culmination of the steward's most critical duties. To understand the castle as a functioning entity, one must first understand the great hall's relentless demand. The scale of this demand was formidable. A modest baronial castle might house a permanent population of 50 to 100 individuals. A great royal or ducal establishment could swell to several hundred. This population was not homogeneous. It comprised the lord's immediate family, his knights and squires, high-ranking administrative officials such as the chaplain and the steward himself, a cohort of men-at-arms, and a vast array of domestic servants. Each of these individuals required daily sustenance, but the nature of that sustenance was rigorously dictated by their station. The management of consumption was, therefore, intrinsically linked to the management of social hierarchy. The foundation of the entire system was grain. The pantry, the domain of the pantler, was concerned almost exclusively with bread. The supply chain began in the fields of the domain or the surrounding manors, where wheat, rye, barley, and oats were cultivated. Once harvested, the grain was transported to the castle's granary, a secure, dry, and well-ventilated structure designed to protect the precious store from damp, vermin, and theft. From the granary, a daily or weekly portion of grain was issued to the castle's mill. It was then ground into flour of varying grades. The finest, whitest flour, milled multiple times and sifted through fine cloth, was reserved for the lord's table. From this came the manchet loaf, a small, light bread of high status. A slightly coarser, darker flour produced chet bread, the standard fare for knights, squires, and senior household members. The coarsest flour, often containing a mixture of wheat and rye, along with the bran from the finer siftings, was baked into maslin or household bread for the lower servants and men-at-arms. The baking itself took place in the bakehouse, where large wood-fired ovens were tended by the castle bakers. The daily bread allowance, or livery, was a cornerstone of an individual's compensation and position. The steward's accounts, the compatus rolls, would meticulously record the bushels of grain drawn from the granary and the number and type of loaves produced, ensuring that output corresponded precisely with the allocated liveries. Nothing illustrates the rigid stratification of castle life so clearly as the quality of one's daily bread. Even the plates themselves could be edible in the form of trenchers, thick, flat slabs of stale bread used to soak up the juices from meat, which were then either eaten by the diner or, more commonly, collected and given as alms to the poor at the castle gate. Parallel to the pantry was the buttery, managed by the butler. Its primary concern was drink. For most of the household, the staple beverage was ale or beer. It was a vital source of calories, safer to drink than much of the available water, and consumed in vast quantities. A standard daily allowance, or livery, for a man-at-arms might be a gallon of ale. The production was a major undertaking. Barley would be drawn from the granary and taken to the brewhouse, where it was malted, mashed, and fermented. The quality of the ale also varied. The best ale was reserved for the high table, while a weaker small beer was brewed for the general populace. In the quiet confines of the steward's chamber, away from the clang of the smithy and the clamor of the great hall, the true machinery of the castle operated. It was not a machine of iron and wood, but one of memory and accountability. Here, amidst the faint scent of beeswax, wood smoke, and aging ink, the economic lifeblood of the entire domain was meticulously tracked, quantified, and controlled. This was the realm of the medieval accountant, an art practiced not with abacuses and ledgers as we might envision, but with humble yet profoundly effective instruments, the tally stick and the parchment roll. The primary challenge for any large medieval household was the management of goods and obligations in a society where coinage could be scarce, and literacy was the preserve of a select few. How does one record the delivery of 3 dozen chickens from a tenant farmer? How does one track the disbursement of wages to a stonemason, or the consumption of firewood over a harsh winter? The answer, for centuries, lay in a simple piece of wood, the tally stick. Typically fashioned from a length of seasoned hazel or willow, a tally stick was a primitive, yet virtually incorruptible, recording device. Its genius lay in its tangible, bilateral nature. Let us examine the process in detail. Imagine a reeve, an official responsible for managing a manor, is receiving a payment of rent in kind from a tenant, say a quantity of barley. A suitable piece of wood, perhaps a foot in length and half an inch square, would be selected. On one of the flat surfaces, the reeve would carve a series of notches. The system of notation, while varying by region and period, adhered to a general hierarchy. A wide notch, the width of a thumb, might signify a pound sterling. A smaller notch, the width of a finger, could represent a shilling. A simple, thin score, a mere scratch in the surface, denoted a pence. Additional symbols could be used for other units of measure, such as a circular hole for a bushel of grain. Once the value of the transaction was carved into the wood, the stick was inscribed with a brief description of the transaction, the tenant's name, the date, the nature of the debt or payment. This was the critical moment. The stick was then split lengthwise, from the top down to a few inches from the bottom, which was left intact as a handle. The split was not a clean, sawn cut, but a deliberate fracture along the grain of the wood. This irregularity was the key to its security. The 2 resulting halves were unique, like a key and its lock. The pattern of the wood grain, the precise angle of the split, and the way the notches were bisected ensured that the 2 pieces could only ever match each other. No one could carve a counterfeit half. One piece, the longer one, was called the stock. This is the origin of our modern financial term, stockholder. The stock was given to the party advancing the goods or money. In our example, the tenant farmer who has paid his rent. It was his receipt, his undeniable proof of payment. The other, shorter piece, known as the foil or counterstock, was retained by the reeve on behalf of the castle or lord. At the end of the accounting period, the tenant's stock could be brought forth and perfectly matched against the reeve's foil to verify the record. This system was used for all manner of transactions, recording debts, acknowledging the receipt of taxes, or as a receipt for goods delivered by merchants. The Royal Exchequer in England used this system for centuries to record tax payments from sheriffs across the kingdom. The sheer volume of these sticks could be immense. They were bundled together with twine, labeled and stored in chests or hung from pegs in the treasury, a vast tactile library of financial obligations. The tally stick was a device of the immediate transaction. It was a physical token of a single event. But how was the overarching financial health of the castle understood? In the popular imagination, the medieval treasury is a space of fantasy, a stone vault overflowing with gold goblets and glittering jewels. This romantic notion, while compelling, obscures the far more intricate and mundane reality. The castle treasury was not merely a storeroom for treasure, it was the administrative heart of a complex economic organism, the central processing point for the wealth, in all its forms, that sustained the castle and its lord. The story of the treasury is a story of two intertwined concepts, coin and kind. It is a narrative written not in heroic verse, but in the painstaking notches on a wooden stick and the dense Latin script of a parchment roll. The physical location of the treasury, or treasury chamber, was dictated by the paramount need for security. Typically situated within the most defensible part of the castle, often the Great Keep or a heavily fortified tower, its construction reflected a profound awareness of its value. The walls were invariably of immense thickness, the door crafted from heavy iron-bound oak. It would be secured not with a single lock, but often with 2 or 3 distinct and complex mechanisms. The keys to these locks would be held by separate, high-ranking officials. The lord himself might hold one, the steward another, and the chaplain, or a designated treasurer, the third. Access, therefore, required the presence and consent of multiple parties, a fundamental principle of medieval security and accountability. The chamber was often small, dark, and poorly ventilated, with windows reduced to mere arrow slits, if they existed at all, their primary function being defense rather than illumination. This was a space designed for storage and security, not for comfort or frequent visitation. Within this secure space, the most obvious form of wealth was coinage. Yet even this was more complex than one might assume. For much of the high medieval period in England, for instance, the primary unit of currency in circulation was the silver penny. Gold coins were rare, used only for the most significant international transactions. Larger denominations were often units of account, such as the shilling, which represented 12 pence, and the pound, which represented 20 shillings or 240 pence, but these did not exist as single physical coins for a very long time. Consequently, large payments required vast quantities of these small silver pennies. They were stored in sealed leather or cloth bags, often marked with their contents value, and stacked within immense, iron-strapped wooden chests known as coffers. These coffers themselves were formidable objects, again secured with their own intricate locks, adding yet another layer of protection. The management of this specie fell to a trusted official, the cofferer, whose sole task was the disbursement and reception of coin under the steward's direction. However, to focus solely on coin is to misunderstand the very foundation of the medieval economy. The vast majority of a castle's income and its lord's wealth arrived not as metal currency, but as kind, that is, in the form of goods and services. The castle was the focal point of a network of manors and agricultural holdings. From these lands flowed the true sustenance of the lordship. Rents were paid in bushels of wheat, oats, and barley, in barrels of ale, in cheeses and sides of bacon, in cartloads of firewood and peat for fuel, in chickens, geese, and eggs. Feudal obligations provided the castle with livestock, with hides for leatherworking, and with wool for spinning. This stream of tangible goods was the lifeblood of the household. While these items were not stored in the treasury chamber itself, their value was meticulously recorded and tracked by the treasury's administration. The steward's accounts were concerned as much with the tally of grain in the granary and the casks of wine in the buttery as with the number of silver pennies in the coffer. The lifeblood of the medieval castle was not stone, nor steel, but the steady, silent flow of coin and commodity. Within the great organism of the household, a complex circulatory system of payment and procurement was in constant operation, a system managed not by the lord and his solar, but by the steward and his clerks in the quiet diligence of the counting house. This chapter concerns the fundamental transaction at the heart of this system, the paying of the piper. It is a study of wages and expenses, of the meticulous records that tracked every farthing dispersed and every bushel of wheat consumed. The primary instrument of remuneration was, of course, coinage. The silver penny formed the bedrock of the English economy for centuries. It was a tangible, reliable unit of value, though its weight and purity could fluctuate. For accounting purposes, this penny was part of a larger, abstract structure. 12 pennies made a shilling, 20 shillings, or 240 pennies made a pound. It is essential to understand that for much of the period, the shilling and the pound were not physical coins, but units of account, concepts used by clerks to tally vast sums on their parchment rolls. A clerk settling the weekly wages would not hand a man a pound coin, but rather 240 individual silver pennies, counted out with care upon a checkered cloth that served as a rudimentary calculator, the exchequer. The hierarchy of payment within the castle walls was as rigid and defined as the feudal structure itself. At the apex was the castellan or constable, the lord's appointed commander. His compensation was often not a simple wage. He might hold the castle as part of a feudal grant, receiving its income in exchange for its upkeep and defense. Alternatively, he might be paid a significant annual fee, a sum recorded in the great rolls of the crown or the private accounts of a magnate. This fee, perhaps 40 or 50 pounds a year, would be paid quarterly or semi-annually, a major expenditure requiring foresight and planning. Below the constable were the knights of the household, the martial elite. Their remuneration was a complex blend of cash, kind, and privilege. A household knight might receive a yearly fee, a retainer to ensure his loyalty and service. But he also received livery, the provision of food, drink, and even clothing from the lord's stores. This was not merely a convenience. It was a significant part of his income, its value carefully calculated by the steward's office. The accounts of the period meticulously detail these payments in kind. A knight was entitled to a certain grade of bread, the finer pain de main or lord's bread, and a specific allowance of wine or strong ale, measured in gallons. His horse, a vital instrument of war, was also provided for, with a daily ration of oats and hay, recorded with the same precision as the knight's own victuals. The bulk of the castle's wage bill, however, was dedicated to the professional garrison. Here, we see a more standardized, if still complex, system of daily pay. The man-at-arms, a mounted soldier in full mail, might earn 8 pence per day. A hobeler, a more lightly equipped horseman, might receive 6 pence. The crossbowman, a highly skilled and valuable specialist, could also command 6 pence per day, his pay reflecting the expense and long training associated with his weapon. The common archer, the backbone of any English field army and a crucial element of castle defense, was typically paid 2 or 3 pence per day. A simple watchman, standing guard on the battlements through the long hours of the night, might receive 2 pence for his vigil. These were the base rates. The reality was more granular. A master crossbowman, responsible for the maintenance of the weapons and the training of other men, would command a higher rate. The captain of the watch would earn a premium over his men. Furthermore, wages could be subject to deductions. Within the administrative ecosystem of the medieval castle, the armory represents not merely a static repository of military hardware, but a dynamic and demanding center of production, maintenance, and meticulous inventory management. While the dramatic clash of steel and the decisive flight of the arrow capture the historical imagination, These moments are predicated upon a far less celebrated, yet arguably more fundamental, reality: the slow, constant, and resource-intensive labor of the forge and the fletcher's workshop. The steward, in his capacity as chief logistical officer, was not a swordsmith nor an archer, but the orchestrator of the complex supply chains that fed these vital crafts. His ledgers, filled with entries for iron billets, charcoal, seasoned wood, goose feathers, and beeswax, are the true testaments to a castle's military readiness. This chapter concerns itself with the material culture and administrative oversight of these two workshops, the forge and the fletcher, which together form the heart of the castle's martial self-sufficiency. We begin at the forge. The castle blacksmith, or armorer, operated in a space defined by sensory extremes: the percussive, rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil, the rushing sigh of the great bellows, the intense, radiating heat of the hearth, and the acrid smells of burning charcoal and hot iron. The physical layout was one of pure function. The hearth itself, typically constructed of stone or packed earth, was the focal point, a crucible where raw material was rendered malleable. Fuel, most commonly charcoal, was a significant logistical concern for the steward. The conversion of wood to charcoal was a specialized process, often undertaken in the castle's outlying lands, and the resulting fuel had to be transported and stored in dry conditions, representing a constant drain on the castle's resources. A single forge could consume a considerable quantity in a day's work. Air was supplied to the hearth by bellows, which could range from a simple, single-chamber design operated by an apprentice to a more sophisticated double-action bellows, capable of providing a continuous and more intense blast of air, thereby achieving higher temperatures necessary for forge welding or working with higher carbon steel. The anvil, a massive block of iron, sometimes with a steel face for greater durability, was the smith's primary work surface. Around it would be an array of tools, each with a specific purpose: tongs of various shapes to grip hot metal, hammers of different weights and head shapes for drawing out, flattening and shaping the iron, and chisels and punches for cutting and piercing. A large trough or barrel of water, the slack tub, stood nearby for quenching, the rapid cooling process that hardens steel. The smith's most common and continuous task was not the forging of new swords, a highly specialized craft often left to dedicated urban guilds, but the relentless duty of maintenance. The primary form of body armor for much of the medieval period was maillis, a garment comprised of thousands of interlocking iron rings. In the damp environment of a castle, rust was a constant adversary. Mail hauberks and coifs had to be regularly tumbled in a barrel of sand and vinegar to scour them clean. More importantly, combat and even rigorous training resulted in broken or lost rings. The armorer and his assistants would spend countless hours painstakingly replacing these individual rings. This involved forging a small piece of iron wire, forming it into a loop, and then either riveting the ends together for the strongest possible connection, or, in the case of lower quality butted mail, simply pinching the ends shut. Each repaired link was a minuscule but essential contribution to a soldier's life. The forging of new items was governed by a strict hierarchy of need. Far more common than swords were the production of utilitarian spearheads, poleaxe blades, and daggers. The popular conception of the medieval castle is one of unyielding permanence, a monolithic structure of stone set against the sky, a bulwark against time itself. Yet this image, while powerful, belies a fundamental truth known intimately to the medieval steward, that a castle was in a perpetual state of slow, inexorable decay. From the moment the last stone was set and the final timber beam hoisted into place, the forces of nature began their patient, relentless assault. The administration of a castle was therefore not merely concerned with garrison and provisions, but with the constant, often thankless, and resource-intensive struggle against entropy. This was the endless task of maintenance, a battle fought not with sword and shield, but with trowel and saw, with lime and lead, with stone and timber. The primary adversary in this struggle was, invariably, water. Rain, driven by the wind, would seek out the smallest imperfection in a wall's surface. It would saturate the porous stone and, most critically, infiltrate the mortar that bound the structure together. Early medieval mortars, a mixture of slaked lime and sand or grit, were effective but fundamentally permeable. Over seasons, this constant ingress of moisture would slowly wash out the lime binder, leaving the sand and aggregate behind as a loose, friable powder. The mortar joints would become voids, channels for yet more water to penetrate deeper into the wall's core. This process was catastrophically accelerated by frost. Water trapped within the mortar or the stone itself would freeze, expanding with a force capable of cracking the very fabric of the building. The freeze-thaw cycle, repeated hundreds of times over a single winter, was a powerful engine of destruction. A hairline crack would become a fissure. A weak mortar joint would crumble and fall away, inviting a deeper penetration of ice in the next frost. This is why the task of pointing or repointing the walls was a near-constant feature of castle life. A mason, or a team of masons, would spend their days on wooden scaffolding, painstakingly scraping out the decayed, crumbling mortar with iron picks and chisels before packing the joints with a fresh, carefully prepared mixture. The preparation of this new mortar was in itself a significant logistical exercise. Limestone or chalk had to be quarried or gathered and then burned for several days in a specially constructed kiln. This process drove off the carbon dioxide, transforming the calcium carbonate into highly reactive calcium oxide, or quicklime. This quicklime was then slaked, a hazardous process involving the careful addition of water. The mixture would hiss and steam, generating immense heat as the quicklime converted to calcium hydroxide, a fine, wet putty. This putty was then left to mature, sometimes for months, before being mixed with sand and water to create the final mortar. The steward's accounts are filled with entries for the cost of fuel for the lime kiln, for the wages of the lime burner, and for the cartage of sand from a suitable riverbed or pit. Every patch of repointing on a curtain wall represented a chain of supply and labor, carefully managed and accounted for. The stone itself, while seemingly eternal, was also vulnerable. Softer sandstones and limestones could be eroded by wind and rain over centuries, a process known as delamination, where the surface flakes away in thin layers. More insidiously, vegetation could take root. Ivy, while picturesque to the modern eye, was a menace, its tendrils working their way into the smallest cracks, widening them over time. Saplings could take root on the wall walks, their roots driving deep into the wall's rubble core, dislodging stones and creating reservoirs for moisture. Regular inspections and the subsequent clearing of this vegetation were prosaic but essential tasks. If stone was the castle's skeleton, timber was its nervous system and flesh. Welcome. We turn our attention now to the less celebrated, yet fundamentally vital, systems that govern life within the castle walls. Beyond the clamor of the smithy and the bustle of the great hall lay a world of constant, meticulous management, concerned with the fundamental inputs and outputs of human existence. This is the realm of water, waste, and wellness, a trinity of concerns that fell squarely within the purview of the castle steward. The popular imagination often pictures the medieval period as one of unmitigated squalor. While hygiene standards were, by modern comparison, rudimentary, the reality within a well-administered castle was not one of chaotic filth, but of managed systems. These systems, though imperfect, represented a pragmatic understanding of cause and effect, and a continuous effort to maintain a livable, defensible, and healthy environment. We begin with water. The procurement of potable water, a fundamental prerequisite for the sustenance of any sizable population, was therefore a primary consideration in the initial siting and subsequent architectural development of the castle. A reliable, secure source of clean water was paramount, not only for daily life but as a critical strategic asset during a siege. The most common and most secure solution was the well. Often, the great well of the castle was one of the first elements to be constructed. Its shaft sunk deep into the earth, sometimes through solid rock, to reach the water table. The wellhead would be situated in a central, protected location, typically the main courtyard or bailey, and sometimes a secondary, even more secure well would be located within the final redoubt of the keep itself. This ensured that even if the outer walls were breached, the defenders would not be forced to surrender due to thirst. The construction of such a well was a significant feat of engineering, requiring specialized laborers and considerable expense. The steward's accounts would meticulously record payments to the master well digger and his team, as well as the cost of ropes, buckets, and the timber and stone for the winding mechanism and the wellhead structure. Where geology did not permit the sinking of a deep well, or as a supplementary source, castles relied upon the cistern. A cistern is essentially a subterranean, waterproof tank designed to collect and store rainwater. Rain falling upon the vast roof surfaces of the keep, the halls, and the towers would be channeled through a series of gutters, typically made of lead or hollowed-out timber, into downpipes that fed directly into the cistern. The interior of these tanks was often lined with plaster or lead to prevent leakage and contamination from the surrounding soil. A simple filtration system, often a layer of sand and gravel at the inlet, would help to clarify the water, removing larger particles of debris washed from the roofs. The steward was responsible for ensuring these cisterns were periodically drained and cleaned of accumulated silt, a laborious but necessary task to maintain the quality of the stored water. Once sourced, water had to be distributed. While the image of serving girls carrying buckets from the well is accurate for many daily tasks, more sophisticated systems existed in high-status castles. Lead pipes, a technology inherited from the Romans, were used to carry water from a cistern or a spring-fed reservoir to key locations within the castle, such as the kitchens, the brewhouse, and perhaps a private lavabo or washing place for the lord's family. These lead pipes were expensive to produce and install, requiring the skilled work of a plumber. The steward would oversee the acquisition of the raw lead and the employment of the craftsmen, ensuring the pipes were laid correctly and maintained against leaks, which were a constant concern. The water that flowed through these systems was used for a multitude of purposes. The castle in peacetime represents a complex but fundamentally stable logistical organism. Its rhythms are governed by the seasons, the agricultural yield of its domain, and the regular passage of merchants and supply trains. The steward's keys unlock storerooms characterized by a steady, predictable churn of inventory. But the turning of a besieger's spade in the earth outside the walls transforms this organism instantly. The castle ceases to be a node in a network and becomes a sealed vessel, an isolated ecosystem whose survival is measured not in seasons, but in sacks of flour and barrels of salted fish. The steward's role shifts from manager to survivalist, and his keys now lock away not just wealth, but the very possibility of continued existence. This is the paradigm of siege and scarcity, the ultimate crucible for the medieval administrator. The preparation for a siege was not an act of sudden panic, but the culmination of years, even decades, of deliberate, patient foresight. A well-managed castle was, in essence, always in a state of latent readiness. The primary calculation was a grim arithmetic of consumption versus duration. The steward, in consultation with the castle constable, had to estimate the total number of mouths to feed. This included the noble family, their retainers, the permanent staff of servants and artisans, and, most critically, the expanded garrison of men-at-arms and archers. To this, one had to add the potential influx of villagers from the surrounding lands, seeking the protection of the castle walls and bringing with them little more than the clothes on their backs. An estimate of, say, 400 souls for a projected siege of 6 months formed the baseline for all subsequent provisioning. The cornerstone of this provision was, without exception, grain. It was the caloric bedrock of the medieval diet. The castle granary was therefore one of the most vital structures within the baileys. Often it was a purpose-built structure, raised from the ground on staddlestones or stone pillars. This design served a dual purpose. It discouraged rats and other vermin from gaining entry from below, and it allowed for the circulation of air, a crucial factor in preventing the onset of mold and rot. The grain, typically wheat and rye for bread, barley for brewing and pottage, and oats for the indispensable war horses and pack animals, was stored either in breathable hemp or jute sacks, or loose in large, timber-lined bins. The steward's ledger would contain a meticulous accounting of this resource, updated regularly. The fight against spoilage was relentless. Cats were not merely pets, but essential members of the castle's pest control team, their presence in the granary officially sanctioned. Regular turning of the loose grain with wooden shovels was also necessary to aerate it and prevent hot spots of moisture from developing, which could lead to catastrophic fungal growth. In the event of a siege, the castle's own mill, whether a large ox-driven stone or more commonly a series of smaller hand-cranked querns, became one of the most important installations, ensuring the garrison was not dependent on pre-milled flour, which had a much shorter shelf life than whole grains. While grain provided bulk, protein was essential for maintaining the fighting strength of the garrison. Preserving meat and fish for long-term storage was a well-understood, if labor-intensive, science. The primary method was salting. In the autumn, after the annual slaughter of livestock that could not be overwintered, the castle's larder would be a scene of intense activity. Great sides of beef and whole pigs would be butchered and systematically cured. Large wooden barrels or stone troughs would be layered with coarse salt and cuts of meat. The salt, a precious and carefully managed commodity in its own right, drew out the moisture, making the flesh inhospitable to the bacteria that cause decay. In this concluding chapter, we turn our attention from the stone and timber reality of the medieval castle to the glass and steel edifices of the modern corporate world. The transition may seem abrupt, the chasm of centuries too wide to bridge. Yet, a careful examination reveals that the echo of the steward's keys, jangling at his belt as he paced the bailey, can still be heard in the quiet hum of today's server rooms and the measured discussions of the executive boardroom. The steward's legacy is not a relic preserved in amber, but a living, breathing set of principles that form the bedrock of contemporary management theory and practice. Let us begin with the most fundamental of the steward's responsibilities, the management of physical resources. The castle was, at its core, a self-contained economic unit, a microcosm of a larger kingdom. Its survival depended entirely on the prudent accumulation and distribution of goods. The steward was the master of this material universe. His domain was the buttery, the pantry, the larder, and the granary. He was intimately familiar with the weight and volume of the stores. He knew, almost to the last grain, how much wheat and barley was held in the castle's stone-lined granaries. He could account for every cask of wine and ale, noting their origin, their age, and their quality. In the larder, he oversaw the inventory of salted meats, the sides of bacon, the wheels of hard cheese, and the barrels of preserved fish, each item a bulwark against the lean months of winter or the sudden privation of a siege. This meticulous, almost obsessive act of accounting is the direct ancestor of modern inventory management. The steward's ledger, with its careful columns of goods received and goods dispersed, finds its contemporary analog in the sophisticated enterprise resource planning, or ERP, systems that are the nerve centers of modern corporations. Where the steward used a quill and parchment to note the delivery of 10 barrels of salted herring, a modern logistics manager now scans a barcode, and the information is instantly populated across a global network. The principle, however, remains immutable. It is the principle of knowing precisely what you have, where it is located, and at what rate it is being consumed. The medieval concept of maintaining a buffer stock, enough grain and salted meat to withstand a 6-month siege, is mirrored in the modern practice of holding safety stock to mitigate supply chain disruptions. The steward's method of using older stock first to prevent spoilage is the rudimentary, untheorized application of the first in, first out, or FIFO accounting method, a standard practice in warehouses worldwide. The technology has transformed, but the essential problem of balancing supply and demand, of preventing waste while ensuring availability, is a challenge the medieval steward and the modern supply chain manager would understand in equal measure. Beyond the mere counting of goods lies the domain of financial administration. The steward was the chief financial officer of the castle estate. He was responsible for the collection of rents and feudal dues, the payment of wages to soldiers and servants, and the procurement of goods and services not produced on the demesne lands. His tools were the manorial roll, an exhaustive record of the estate's tenants and their obligations, and the tally stick. The tally stick, a seemingly primitive device, was in fact a remarkably sophisticated and fraud-resistant accounting tool. A hazel or willow stick would be marked with notches of varying sizes to represent sums of money. The stick was then split lengthwise, with the debtor and the creditor each retaining one half. The two halves, called the stock and the foil, could only be perfectly matched with each other, creating an unforgeable receipt and a clear record of transaction. And so, the final key is turned. The larders are full, the ledgers are closed, and a deep quiet settles over the castle walls. The steward's work is done. Thank you for joining us here on the Whispered Lore. May your own thoughts be as ordered and peaceful. Let the day's concerns be locked away, and allow yourself to drift off to sleep. Rest well. Good night.